When the blizzards of '62 came roaring through the mountains, only one man's ingenuity could save him from the relentless cold. His creation, an unexpected solution, became the difference between life and death in one of the most unforgiving winters the Rockies had ever known. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of survival and innovation, let us know where you're watching from. And if you find these tales of survival as gripping as we do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more shocking than today's. Samuel Hale had spent years in these rugged mountains, growing familiar with the icy grip of winter. Each year, the storms seemed fiercer, the winds howling through the valleys with a vengeance only nature could command. This year, though, something felt different. The snow had already begun to fall earlier than expected, and by late November it was relentless, the landscape buried beneath an endless layer of white. Samuel, a man hardened by the elements, stood in the doorway of his cabin, looking out into the wilderness. His breath clouded the air as the wind howled through the tall pines, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold that seeped deep into the bones. His cabin, built with careful precision and fortified through years of experience, was his sanctuary in these harsh times. The logs, thick and solid, kept the worst of the wind at bay, but it was never enough to fully shut out the cold. His only companion was the silence of the mountains, a silence that was sometimes louder than the fiercest storm. He had built a life here, but even he couldn't escape the reminder that winter was a battle. The wind screamed like a wild animal searching for any weakness. And there, at the edge of the clearing, Samuel saw it. An idea that had been growing in his mind for weeks, a spark of inspiration that might change everything. The idea came from something as simple as a fence, but not just any fence, a storm fence. Samuel had seen the way winds bent and shattered fences, how the pressure of the snow could make them collapse with just one strong gust. But there was a design he had been toying with, one that could prevent that from happening. If he could build it right, his cabin, and perhaps all the cabins in the valley, might withstand the storms and keep the warmth inside, where it belonged. But the storm was coming, and it wouldn't wait for his plan to come to fruition. He had no choice but to begin the work now, before the snow piled up even higher, before the wind tore through the land. Samuel Hale was about to attempt something no one had dared before, and the winds of '62 would test whether his vision could truly stand up to nature's fury. It was late afternoon when the first signs of the storm appeared. Samuel had been working tirelessly through the day, gathering supplies from the small shed behind his cabin. The wind was picking up, and dark clouds began to blot out. The sky giving the mountains a grim, shadowed look. The chill in the air was sharper now, biting at his skin like 1,000 icy needles. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. He made his way to the edge of the cabin, where he had decided to build the storm fence. The design in his mind was simple but practical. It wasn't just a simple barrier. He wanted a structure that would redirect the wind, guide it away from the cabin like a shield. It would need to be tall enough to rise above the snow, sturdy enough to resist the battering winds, and flexible enough to withstand the weight of the snow. He began with the posts, digging deep into the frozen earth to anchor them firmly. His hands were numb, but he pushed through, knowing that every minute counted. The storm was closing in, and he had no time to waste. By the time night fell, Samuel had managed to place a few of the posts, but the wind had grown stronger. Snowflakes began to fall, small at first, but rapidly building in intensity. The air was thick with it, the snow swirling around him in an angry dance. Samuel knew he had only a short time before the full force of the storm would descend on the mountain. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, a welcome warmth against the growing cold. But outside, the storm continued its advance, pushing the snow higher and higher, burying everything in its path. Samuel glanced at the cabin's door, knowing that it wouldn't be long before he would have to retreat to its safety. But the fence, the one thing that could keep the storm at bay, was still incomplete. He looked at the posts he had placed in the ground, a line of defense, but not yet the shield he had envisioned. The wind howled louder, a wail of frustration. Samuel's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart racing with the knowledge that he was on the edge of something far greater than he had realized. Would his storm fence hold? Would it be enough to withstand the fury of nature? And in this battle of man versus mountain, who would come out victorious? Samuel took one last look at his creation. The storm was nearly upon him, and in the heart of that storm his resolve would be tested. By the time the first true gusts of the storm hit, Samuel had retreated into the warmth of his cabin. The wind howled against the walls, shaking the logs and rattling the shutters. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a small comfort against the fury of the blizzard raging outside. Snow piled up against the door, and the world outside had become a white blur of swirling, violent winds and drifting snow. Inside, Samuel paced the cabin, his mind racing. He had never faced a storm quite like this. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to take revenge for his intrusion, testing him and his creation with every furious gust. He had built his storm fence with care, but now it would face its true trial. He couldn't help but wonder if it would stand, if he had made a mistake, if the cold would seep through the cracks, if the wind would find its way inside. Samuel sat by the fire, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he listened to the storm's growing intensity. The cabin, despite its sturdy construction, wasn't invincible. He had reinforced the walls and roof, but even the strongest structures could be vulnerable in a storm this fierce. The fence outside, his lifeline against the worst the blizzard had to offer, felt almost like a distant thought now, as if the howling wind was trying to erase it from existence. He couldn't afford to dwell on doubt. He had made the decision to trust his instincts, and now those instincts would have to be enough. He glanced at the wall, where his rifle rested against the log, within easy reach in case the worst should happen. In these conditions, anything was possible. The storm had the power to disorient, to tear through everything in its path. But Samuel had lived in these mountains long enough to know that survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was about patience, planning, and the will to endure. His storm fence had been built with those principles in mind, and now it was time to see if it would hold true. Hours passed, and the wind seemed to grow more violent with each minute. Samuel kept the fire stoked, the warmth filling the cabin, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. His mind wandered to the fence, imagining how the wind must be battering it, pushing against its frame, testing the limits of his design. But he had done everything he could. There was nothing more he could do now except wait. And wait he did, listening to the storm as it raged outside, the relentless howl of the wind filling the cabin. Samuel had faced many challenges in his life, but this storm, this blizzard of 62, was different. It was a reminder of the raw power of nature, a force that no man could ever fully tame. And in the midst of it, Samuel found himself wondering if he had made the right choice in trusting his storm fence to stand against it. As the hours dragged on, Samuel finally closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him into a restless sleep. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but he knew that tomorrow would be the true test of his creation. The fence, the cabin, and his resolve would face the full weight of the storm's fury. The morning came slowly, the storm finally beginning to wind down. Samuel woke to a heavy silence that seemed unnatural after the chaos of the night. The wind had ceased its howling, but the world outside was still buried under layers of thick, powdery snow. He rose from his bed, stretching stiff muscles, and moved to the window to peer outside. The view that met him was both beautiful and overwhelming. The snow had fallen in deep drifts, blanketing everything in sight. The mountains, once dark and imposing, were now veiled in white. their jagged peaks barely visible against the lightening sky. It was a surreal scene, as if the world had been reborn overnight. Samuel bundled himself in his furs and made his way outside, the cold biting into his skin as he opened the door and stepped into the snow. The air was crisp, the scent of winter sharp in his nose. His eyes quickly scanned the area around the cabin, searching for signs of damage. The storm had been fierce, but the storm fence, was still standing. He walked toward it, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the structure. At first glance, it seemed intact, the posts strong and steady in the ground. The design had worked. The storm fence had held up, redirecting the wind and preventing the snow from piling up too close to the cabin. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Samuel couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His instincts, his obsession with survival, had led him to this moment. He had built something that had withstood nature's fury. The storm fence wasn't just a piece of wood and wire. It was a testament to his resilience, a symbol of his determination to survive against the odds. But as he walked along the length of the fence, inspecting it more closely, he noticed something. The snow around the base of the posts had been pushed inward in some places, and a few of the supports had shifted slightly, as if the force of the wind had tried to find a weakness. Samuel knelt down, his fingers brushing the snow as he examined the damage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that nature always had the upper hand. The storm had been a harsh teacher, but Samuel had learned something invaluable from it. His storm fence had withstood the worst the mountain could throw at it, but the next storm, there would always be a next storm, would be a new test. He stood up, his breath clouding in the cold air, and took a deep breath. He had built his fence with care and thought, but the real lesson was that survival wasn't just about building something that could endure. It was about the ability to adapt, to learn, and to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. With that thought, Samuel turned back toward the cabin, knowing that even if the storm fence had passed its first test, there would be more challenges ahead. But for now he had weathered the storm, and in this world that was enough. The storm had left the landscape in a frozen stillness. Samuel Hale stood outside the cabin, his breath curling in the cold air as he looked over the aftermath. The snow had covered the ground in a pristine layer of white, but it wasn't just the snow that held his attention, it was the stark silence that followed the storm. The usual sounds of nature, the whispers of the wind through the pines, the calls of distant animals, were all swallowed by the heavy weight of the winter air. Inside the cabin, the fire still crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel had returned to his post by the hearth, but his thoughts were far from the warmth. He had made it through the worst of the storm, but the hardest part was still ahead. The cold would continue to gnaw at his bones, and the weight of the snow would press down on the fragile world he had built in these mountains. The question in his mind wasn't whether the storm fence had worked. It had. But would it work again and again as the winter deepened? As he sat near the fire, Samuel couldn't ignore the pressing reality. The season of storms was far from over. This was just the beginning. The winter of 1862 would likely bring more blizzards, and with them, more challenges. His storm fence had passed its first trial, but it was no guarantee that it would endure the next one. No matter how solidly he built his defenses, nature was always waiting for an opportunity to strike. Outside, the wind had started to pick up again, though not with the same fury as the night before. It felt like a reminder, a promise, that more was to come. Samuel adjusted his woolen coat and tightened his scarf. There was something about this place, this cold, that had a way of testing a man's resolve. It wasn't just the weather, it was the isolation, the sense of helplessness that came with being so far from civilization. Every decision, every mistake had consequences here. If he failed to prepare, if the storm fence couldn't hold, if the cabin proved too weak, there would be no one to help. The only person Samuel could rely on was himself. The pressure of the cold crept into the cabin, and Samuel could feel it in his bones. Even with the fire burning, there was something about the way the air felt that made the warmth feel distant. The fence had held, but that wasn't enough. There was no such thing as complete safety out here, not against the full force of the wilderness. But Samuel had come to terms with that. Survival in the mountains was never guaranteed. It was about doing everything you could to stack the odds in your favor, and then, when the time came, having the will to fight. The wind howled again, and this time Samuel didn't flinch. He had learned over the years that the mountain would never stop testing him, and neither could he stop testing himself. He needed to stay vigilant, focused. The storm fence was only a piece of the puzzle, a solution to one problem. There were more to come, and he would face each one as it came. As the days passed, Samuel continued to work on small improvements to the fence. There was always something that could be done, something that could be stronger or better. The winter had a way of reminding him that there was never a moment to stop improving, never a moment to relax. In these mountains, complacency meant death. By early December, the air had turned colder, and Samuel could feel the strain in his every movement. The snow had become more than just a nuisance. It had turned into a constant presence, a reminder of the harshness that surrounded him. The storm fence stood strong, its posts anchored deeply into the frozen earth, but Samuel knew that its stability was only as good as the conditions around it. Winter had settled in fully, and the snow didn't just cover the ground, it blanketed the entire landscape in a way that left no room for mistakes. Samuel found himself working more frequently with the fence, making sure the posts were secure and adjusting the wire mesh that held the structure together. The wind had started to pick up again, swirling snow into the air in a constant dance that blurred the line between earth and sky. But even as he worked, his thoughts were elsewhere. The weather was the obvious threat, the one that everyone knew to prepare for. But Samuel had learned long ago that the real danger on the frontier wasn't always visible. The day had begun as any other, with Samuel checking his traps and gathering firewood from the surrounding trees. The snow had begun to fall heavier, more than usual for this time of year. But as the afternoon wore on, something started to feel off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he moved toward his cabin. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the wind seemed to carry an unnatural stillness, as though the world around him had gone silent in anticipation. He reached the cabin and quickly set his pack down. The faintest noise caught his ear, an unsettling low growl coming from the woods. It was faint but unmistakable. His heart rate quickened. A mountain lion? A bear? Or something else? Samuel had lived among these mountains for years and knew the animals that roamed these parts, but this sound was different. It wasn't the sharp, sudden growl of a predator preparing to pounce. It was a long, low rumble that seemed to reverberate in his chest. His rifle was already on the table, but Samuel didn't grab it immediately. He had learned to be patient, to listen before reacting. He quietly approached the door and peered out through a small crack in the wooden shutters. The snow was falling in sheets now, but through the blur, Samuel saw something move, something large. His stomach tightened. It wasn't a bear. The shape was too sleek, too silent in its movements. The creature was circling the cabin, its presence a quiet, creeping threat. A wolf, not just one. There were several of them, their eyes gleaming with hunger, drawn to the scent of food. Wolves were not uncommon in these mountains, but they had never been so bold, so persistent. Samuel had seen packs before, but this one felt different. It wasn't the usual group hunting in silence. These wolves were acting with an almost calculated purpose. Samuel's grip on the doorframe tightened as he felt the weight of the moment. The snow fell harder, blurring his vision, but the danger was undeniable. The storm fence had kept out the wind and snow, but it couldn't keep out the wolves. The mountain was testing him again, But this time, it wasn't the cold or the wind. It was something far more dangerous, something with teeth. The wolves had come, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Samuel's instincts kicked in, and he knew the fight for survival was about to take on a new form. The wolves circled the cabin with a slow, deliberate pace. Their movements were calculated, their eyes gleaming in the snow as they watched Samuel's every move. The low growls like distant thunder rumbled from the pack as they paced around the perimeter, testing the defenses. Samuel had seen wolves before, heard them at night as they howled at the moon, but never had they come this close, this persistent. He watched through the crack in the shutters, his heart pounding in his chest. The storm fence had kept out the worst of the winter winds, but there was no way it could stop a pack of wolves. The animals were too intelligent, too resourceful. They had come for food, and once they set their sights on prey, they wouldn't stop until they had it. Samuel glanced around the cabin, weighing his options. The walls were sturdy, but the windows, small and high up, were vulnerable. The door, reinforced and solid, was his best defense. But the wolves had already proven they weren't going to just stand by. The scent of food, likely his preserved meat inside, was too tempting. He moved quietly through the cabin, gathering supplies. His rifle, of course, was the first thing he reached for, but even as he held it in his hands, he knew it might not be enough. Wolves were fast, and in the deep snow, they had the advantage of mobility. He needed to think fast and stay one step ahead of the pack. Stepping cautiously to the door, he peered out once again. The wolves were closer now, their fur blending in with the snow. The air was thick with tension, a feeling Samuel had grown accustomed to over the years. Survival was never guaranteed, but the key was never letting fear control you. He had to outthink them. The wolves paused in their circling, their noses twitching as they picked up on his presence inside. Samuel's hand tightened around the rifle. The pack was too close now. He wasn't sure how much longer the storm fence would hold, especially with the wind picking up once more. But what he did know was that he couldn't let these wolves break into the cabin. They weren't just after food, they were after his life. He quickly checked his supplies. A few traps he had set earlier that day, a block of salt, and some dried herbs. He could use the traps to lure them away, but that would only give him a moment's respite. It was the wolves' persistence that made them so dangerous. They wouldn't give up, not easily. Then an idea hit him. If the pack was drawn to the scent of food, he could turn that to his advantage. He moved to the back of the cabin, grabbed a few pieces of dried meat, and set them just outside the door, in the snow. It wasn't a large sacrifice, but it might buy him the time he needed. The wolves were hungry, and they wouldn't be able to resist the smell of fresh meat, even if it was a trap. With the bait set, Samuel retreated back inside, keeping his eye on the pack. His pulse quickened as he saw the wolves edge closer to the meat, their hunger overcoming their caution. This was it, their moment of weakness. As the first wolf stepped toward the meat, Samuel braced himself. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had one chance to keep them at bay. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, rifle raised, ready to defend the cabin against the pack. But just as the first wolf lunged for the meat, a howl pierced the air, and the pack surged forward. The storm had truly come. And now, so had the fight for survival. The wolves surged forward in a blur of fur and flashing teeth. Samuel barely had time to react before the first wolf darted toward the meat. He fired his rifle, the shot echoing through the wilderness, but the wolf was too fast. It dodged, and with a sharp, vicious growl, it lunged for the door. The other wolves followed, moving in unison like a well-trained army, their eyes hungry and focused. Samuel's heart raced as he slammed the door shut just in time, the force of the wolves' impact rattling the frame. The air was thick with the sound of claws scrabbling against wood, their determination to get inside be evident in every movement. Samuel's breath was sharp in his chest as he quickly moved to the back window, where he had set another trap, more dried meat and a few traps, hoping to lead the wolves away. The howling outside grew louder as more wolves joined the fray. The pack was relentless, pushing against the walls, their teeth gnashing at the cracks in the door. Samuel knew that the wolves weren't just trying to get in for food. They were testing him. They wanted to break him, to wear him down until he gave in. In that moment, Samuel understood something he had known all along but had never felt so keenly before. Survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental fortitude. If he lost control, if he let the fear and chaos take over, he wouldn't make it. These wolves were as much a test of his spirit as they were of his defenses. With the wolves pushing against the door, Samuel quickly grabbed his rifle again, making sure the bolt was loaded. He couldn't afford to miss. He had to keep the pack at bay. He didn't know how long the storm fence would hold or how long the wolves would keep up their assault, but he had to make every shot count. He took his position by the window, watching the wolves as they circled the cabin. They were smart, too smart. Samuel could see their eyes glinting with intelligence, and he knew that each one of them was calculating the best way to break through. They weren't acting out of mindless hunger. They were strategizing, just as he had. As the pack continued to press against the cabin, Samuel's mind raced for a solution. He needed to break the pack's focus, throw them off balance. He couldn't just defend the cabin forever. He needed to make them think twice. It was then that Samuel realized the key. The pack wasn't just hunting him. They were hunting his weaknesses. They knew that the door was the most vulnerable point, and they were focusing all their energy there. But if he could make the wolves think there was easier prey elsewhere, they might leave. The storm fence had done its part, but now he needed to outsmart them. He grabbed the rest of the dried meat, throwing it far out into the snow. It was a gamble, but if he could lure them away from the cabin and towards the food, he might buy enough time to regroup. The wolves hesitated for a moment, their gaze shifting from the door to the food outside. Then, one by one, they began to move toward the bait. Samuel's heart pounded as he watched them, knowing this was his chance. As the last wolf turned away, Samuel pushed open the door just enough to slip through. He moved swiftly, silently, staying low as he approached the pack. The wolves, now focused on the meat, were distracted. Samuel raised his rifle once more, steadying his breath. This wasn't just a fight against the wolves. It was a fight against everything the mountain could throw at him. And this time, he was ready to fight back. The wolves were almost too fast. Their instincts were honed by centuries of survival in the harshest conditions, and they knew how to turn every disadvantage into an opportunity. But Samuel had lived long enough in these mountains to understand that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about patience, preparation, and knowing when to strike. As the wolves focused on the bait he had set further into the snow, Samuel's eyes darted across the snowy landscape. He moved silently, his every step calculated. The scent of the meat was thick in the air, and as the pack drew closer, the faintest crunch of snow beneath their paws grew louder. They were so close, too close. Samuel's fingers tightened around his rifle, his heart pounding as he carefully raised it to his shoulder. The wolves, distracted by the food, were no longer paying attention to the cabin. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had paused, the violent struggle for survival suspended in time. He took a breath, steadying his hand, his eye trained on the lead wolf, the one closest to the food. Its back was turned, but its ears twitched, sensing something. Just as the wolf began to turn, Samuel fired. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the mountain, a loud, definitive sound that broke the stillness of the moment. The wolf fell to the snow, a single shot through its chest. The others froze. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the snow settling around them. Then chaos erupted. The pack surged forward, their primal instincts kicking in. The wolves howled in a mixture of confusion and rage, realizing that their prey was no longer passive. They scattered, moving with terrifying speed, but Samuel was ready. He had anticipated this. The first shot had thrown them off balance, and now he needed to capitalize on it. He sprinted to the side of the cabin, using the wall as cover as he moved with the practiced fluidity of someone who had spent years in the wilderness. The rifle was still in his hands, but now it wasn't just about shooting, it was about staying one step ahead. The wolves were fast, but he was faster. He'd spent too many years evading danger to be caught off guard now. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, he saw another wolf creeping toward the door. Samuel's rifle was already raised, his finger on the trigger. One more shot, one more chance to turn the tide. He fired, the crack of the gun followed by the yelping sound of a wolf hitting the ground. The remaining wolves hesitated, their focus now divided. The pack had been shattered, and the fear that followed was palpable. Samuel's heart raced, but he knew he couldn't stop yet. Wolves, like all predators, were persistent. If one wolf didn't come for him, another would. He took a deep breath, slowly backing toward the cabin's door. He didn't need to fight all of them. He just needed to survive long enough for the pack to retreat, to give him space to breathe. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind remained clear. He had faced worse. He had come too far to let a pack of wolves take everything from him now. With a final glance toward the remaining wolves, Samuel stepped back into the cabin, pulling the door closed behind him. His hands shook as he secured the door, leaning against it for a moment as he caught his breath. He had done it. For now, at least, he had survived. The storm raged on into the night, but inside Samuel Hale's cabin there was an eerie peace. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder that the world beyond his cabin was still wild, untamed, and dangerous. But inside there was warmth, there was safety, and there was a sense of something more, a quiet victory that could only be understood by someone who had fought to survive. Samuel sat by the hearth, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. His hands were still cold from the fight, but the fire provided comfort, the orange glow flickering across the log walls of his home. The wolves had retreated, leaving behind only the silence of the storm. The pack had tested him, but Samuel had proven stronger. He had built this cabin with his own hands, a fortress against nature's fury. And now, in the midst of the harshest winter the Rockies had seen in years, it had proven its worth. The storm fence, the reinforced door, the careful planning, it had all come together in this moment. The wolves, once a looming threat, had become another test, and Samuel had passed it. But he knew better than to think that this was the end. In the wilderness, survival was never guaranteed. The storm would pass, but winter would continue. And the wolves, those predators that moved in the shadows, would never truly leave. They were part of the landscape, part of the mountain that Samuel had chosen to call home. And as long as he was here, he knew that the fight for survival would never stop. The fire crackled softly as Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for just a moment. He was tired, his body aching from the day's struggle, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction that came with knowing he had won this battle. He thought about the storm fence, the effort he had put into it, the lessons he had learned about the mountains and himself. His invention had worked. It had held firm, just as he had hoped. It had stood strong in the face of the storm, just as he had. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing your weaknesses, your limits, and building something that would outlast even the fiercest storm. Samuel's legacy would not be written in books or carved into stone. It would be remembered in the log cabins that dotted the mountains, in the people who survived because of his innovations. It would be the quiet knowledge passed down through the generations that sometimes the simplest ideas could make the difference between life and death. As the fire burned low, Samuel stood, his body stiff from the day's strain. He walked to the door and stood in the doorway, looking out into the night. The snow had begun to settle, the storm's fury easing, but the mountains were still there, silent, watchful, always testing him. And Samuel Hale, a man who had learned to survive through ingenuity and grit, stood ready for whatever the wilderness would throw at him next.